Have you ever been told you don't belong only to realize, in the very moment of rejection, that you're the one everyone will need on a transatlantic flight? A black CEO was humiliated, escorted out of first class because of prejudice, because of assumptions. But when disaster struck miles above the ocean, when engines faltered and fear spread like wildfire, every eye turned back to the very man they had dismissed. What would you do if the lives of hundreds depended on you? Would you rise, even when the world said you shouldn't be there in the first place? Imagine yourself in that seat, your dignity questioned, your worth doubted, and then faced with a choice: stay silent or stand up and act. This is not just a story about saving a flight. It is about saving humanity in the smallest, most fragile of moments. Stay with us as we uncover the journey of Jonathan Carter, the man who proved that belonging is never given, it is claimed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss stories that will move your heart and challenge your soul. Jonathan Carter adjusted the strap of his worn leather briefcase as he stepped into the bright, echoing terminal of Los Angeles International Airport. It was early morning, the kind of morning when sunlight streamed through wide glass panels and lit up the polished floors like a stage. He moved with calm purpose, yet inside there was always a quiet tension that followed him, the kind that came from years of proving, again and again, that he belonged. Today wasn't just another business trip. It was a flight to New York for a medical technology conference where he was scheduled to present PulseTech's newest research on emergency cardiac devices. For Jonathan, 34 years old and already a CEO, this was not only about his company, it was about his community, his mother, and every silent moment when someone had looked at him and thought, "You don't belong here." He held a first-class ticket, purchased by the board of PulseTech. They insisted, "You need to arrive rested. Jonathan, you've got a keynote." He had resisted at first. He was used to flying coach, blending in, drawing as little attention as possible. But this time, he gave in. He told himself he had earned it, more than earned it. When Jonathan reached the gate, boarding had just begun. The line was filled with business travelers, expensive suits, polished briefcases, the quiet hum of phone calls and watch checking. He presented his boarding pass. The gate agent smiled politely, scanned it, and waved him through without hesitation. Inside the jet bridge, the air was cooler, the metallic hum louder. He stepped into the aircraft, nodded at the flight attendant near the door, and made his way toward first class. His seat was near the front, by the window. He slid his briefcase under the seat, smoothed his jacket, and took a breath. But peace never lasted long. "Excuse me," a sharp voice cut through the boarding chatter. A man in his 50s, silver hair perfectly combed, stood in the aisle. His navy blazer looked freshly pressed. His tie knotted with precision. His name, Jonathan would later learn, was Richard Coleman. At this moment, all Jonathan saw was a face twisted with irritation. "That's my seat," Richard said flatly, his eyes narrowing on Jonathan. Jonathan glanced at his boarding pass, then back at the placard above. "Seat 3A. His seat." Calmly, he responded, "I believe this is mine." Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. "No, son. First class is reserved for passengers who actually paid for it." His gaze swept Jonathan from head to toe, lingering on his modest jacket, his well-worn shoes, the skin he had lived in his whole life. "People like you don't sit here." For a moment, Jonathan sat frozen. He had heard variations of this line since he was a teenager, in classrooms, in boardrooms. Now, here, at 34, even with the title of CEO behind his name, The weight of those words still stung. A flight attendant appeared. Emily Dawson, tall, blonde hair pinned back in a neat bun, leaned toward Richard first. "Is there a problem, sir?" "Yes," Richard said briskly, pointing at Jonathan. "This gentleman is in my seat. Can you please handle it?" Emily turned to Jonathan, her professional smile already faltering. "May I see your boarding pass?" Sir Jonathan swallowed the lump rising in his throat. He handed it over, steady hands betraying the storm inside. She scanned it quickly, frowned, then looked at him as if searching for some mistake. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out into the aisle for just a moment while we sort this out." Passengers around them grew quiet. Conversations paused, eyes turned. Jonathan could feel the weight of strangers' stares pressing against his back. Some curious, some sympathetic, but more than a few skeptical. He knew that look, the look that said maybe he doesn't belong. He stood, slow and deliberate, refusing to let anger show. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, the one she used when the world turned cruel. "Never give them your temper. Show them your dignity." He followed Emily a few steps down the aisle. She lowered her voice, but not enough that nearby passengers couldn't overhear. "Sir, are you certain this is your ticket? First-class seats are they're limited, and sometimes there are mistakes." Jonathan met her eyes. His voice was even, calm. "There's no mistake. The seat is mine. I belong here." Her jaw tightened. "We'll need to verify. Please step aside until we resolve this." Richard slid into seat 3A with a satisfied smirk, as if the matter was closed. Jonathan stood there, feeling every second stretch. His chest tightened, not from shame, but from the exhausting familiarity of it all. Minutes passed. Other passengers boarded, squeezing by, some glancing at him like he was part of the scenery, others whispering. He caught fragments, "fake ticket," trying his luck. Never seen that before. Finally, Emily returned with another attendant. They confirmed the boarding pass. It was valid. Jonathan's seat, not Richard's. There was an awkward pause. Emily's expression shifted, but instead of apology, there was annoyance, like Jonathan had caused unnecessary trouble. "Sir," she said, forcing politeness, "you may return to your seat." Jonathan nodded once, no smile, no thank you. He walked back, each step heavy but measured. Richard reluctantly stood and moved to his actual seat. As Jonathan settled into 3A, he felt no victory, only the sting of humiliation that lingered in the cabin air. The plane wasn't even in the air, and already he had been told again that his presence was a mistake. But Jonathan Carter had lived a lifetime of being told he didn't belong, and he had also lived a lifetime of proving, sometimes painfully, that he did. He leaned against the window, the runway stretching beyond. Somewhere deep inside, a storm brewed, but his face remained composed, strong, dignified. He didn't know yet that before this flight ended, he would be asked once more to prove himself. Only this time, the cost of doubt would not just be his pride. It would be life and death. Jonathan Carter sat back in his seat, the hum of boarding still buzzing around him. He kept his gaze fixed on the window, but his mind wasn't on the tarmac outside. It was traveling backwards, years away from this airplane, back to the streets of Detroit where his story had begun. He was 12 years old again, standing at the cracked kitchen counter, watching his mother come home from a 12-hour night shift at the hospital. Her scrub smelled faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion. She never complained, though her hands trembled when she reached for her coffee cup. She would smile at Jonathan and his younger sister, as if her fatigue was a secret she could hide. His father had died when Jonathan was 9. A heart attack, sudden, final. There had been no warning, no chance to fight. One moment his father was laughing at the dinner table. The next, he was gone. That day left a scar Jonathan carried in silence. It was also the day he promised himself, "I will understand the heart. I will fight back where others couldn't." In the months after, he studied at the library for hours, devouring every book he could find on biology, medicine, and the human body. While other kids played basketball in the alley, Jonathan was sketching diagrams of arteries and chambers, tracing how blood flowed, how life could stop in a single beat. High school was a battlefield of a different kind. He was brilliant, yes, but brilliance didn't always shield him from the words whispered behind his back. Scholarship kid. Doesn't belong. Some teachers lifted him up, but others looked through him as though his answers were borrowed, as though someone like him couldn't possibly excel on his own. He remembered one afternoon vividly. He had won first place in the regional science fair for a project on early cardiac arrest detection. Standing with his ribbon, he overheard a father mutter to another parent, probably some charity case. They give those prizes out to make a point. Jonathan had smiled politely when they congratulated him, but inside, the words cut deep. It was then he realized he could spend his life proving himself over and over, or he could build something undeniable, something no prejudice could erase. College at Johns Hopkins was where his vision sharpened. Long nights in the lab, cheap coffee, missed parties, and constant work. He wasn't there to simply graduate. He was there to build a future, to find answers his father never had, to honor the sweat and sacrifice of his mother. It was also where Pulse Tech was born, first as an idea scribbled on a napkin during a midnight study session with a friend, then as a research project, and eventually as a company. The idea was simple but powerful. Create portable devices that could save lives in emergencies, especially in places where help was far away. By his late 20s, PulseTech had grown into a startup with a small team and big dreams. Jonathan became CEO, though the title felt strange at first. He wasn't chasing status, he was chasing impact. Every time he spoke about PulseTech, he thought of his father's last day, of the moments when technology could have meant the difference between life and death. And yet, no matter how high he climbed, the old ghosts followed him. Boardrooms where he was mistaken for an assistant, investors who asked, and whose actually in charge conferences where security guards double-checked his badge while letting others pass without question. That was the weight Jonathan carried into every room, the silent armor of patience, dignity, and resilience. And now, on this plane, after being told once more that his seat was not his own, he felt the old wound reopen. He breathed slowly, letting the hum of the engines calm him. He reminded himself of the truth he wasn't here by accident. He had earned this. He looked down at his hands, calloused in places from years of tinkering with prototypes, from nights soldering wires and adjusting circuits when PulseTech couldn't yet afford a full lab. These hands had built something real. These hands had held patients' lives in emergency trials. These hands had signed contracts with hospitals that believed in his vision. But what people saw, too often, wasn't his hands or his mind. It was his skin. He closed his eyes for a moment and heard his mother's voice again. Softer now, gentler. The world may not always see you, Jonathan, but you see yourself. You know who you are. That is what matters. The intercom crackled overhead, pulling him back. A flight attendant welcomed passengers, asked everyone to settle in. The rows filled. Luggage bins clicked shut. The plane smelled faintly of coffee and fabric cleaner. Jonathan turned his head slightly. Richard Coleman was across the aisle, pretending to scroll on his phone, though Jonathan could feel the man's glances, sharp and dismissive. It wasn't new. Men like Richard had been in his life since he was a boy. The gatekeepers, the doubters, the ones who acted as if opportunity was their private property. Jonathan exhaled slowly. His chest tightened, but he did not speak. His silence wasn't surrender. It was restraint. There would be a time to act, but not now. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine the conference ahead, the stage lights, the audience of doctors and researchers, the chance to show the world Pulse-Tech's progress. The device was small enough to fit in a backpack, yet powerful enough to restart a failing heart. It could one day be on every plane, every school campus, every rural clinic. That was his dream, to make life-saving tools accessible, no matter who you were or where you lived. This flight was supposed to be simple. A few hours of quiet before he stepped onto that stage, but destiny rarely asked permission. As the plane doors closed and the safety demonstration began, Jonathan's thoughts slowed. He leaned his head back against the seat, letting the weight of his journey press down on him like gravity. Every insult, every dismissal, every shadow of doubt, they had all brought him here. He didn't yet know what awaited in the hours ahead. He didn't know that before the landing gear touched down in New York, his hands would once again hold a life. His mind would once again face doubt, and the seat they had tried to take from him would become the place from which he would save them all. For now, he closed his eyes and breathed. He carried the past within him, but he also carried the strength that had grown from it. That was the weight he bore and the gift he would one day give. The engines hummed louder as the plane taxied away from the gate. Passengers settled into their seats, fastening belts, flipping through magazines, powering down phones. In the middle of it all, Jonathan Carter sat quietly in 3A, his hands folded loosely on his lap. He looked calm to the casual eye, but inside, the silence was not peace. It was a battle. Richard Coleman leaned back across the aisle, adjusting his cufflinks as though he had just won something. His smirk lingered, a trace of triumph. Even though the truth was clear, the seat had never been his. He stole glances at Jonathan now and then, as if to say, "You might have the ticket, but you'll never have the place." Jonathan stared straight ahead. He could feel Richard's eyes, feel the judgment radiating like heat, but he chose not to respond. He had learned long ago that not every fight deserved his energy. Some fights were traps, designed to drain, to distract, and yet his chest felt heavy. He wondered how many others on this plane had watched the scene unfold and silently agreed with Richard. The flight attendant, Emily Dawson, passed down the aisle with a tray of water bottles. Her smile was stiff when she reached Jonathan. "Water," she asked, her tone polite but clipped. He nodded, accepted the bottle, and whispered a quiet, "Thank you." She moved on without meeting his eyes. He twisted the cap, took a sip, and let the coolness ease the dryness in his throat. He thought of his mother again, of her advice whenever he faced this familiar storm. "Dignity, Jonathan. Let them see you steady when they expect you to break." But it was hard. Sitting in that seat felt less like comfort and more like a test. Every second stretched. Each rustle of paper or cough from nearby passengers seemed amplified by the tension. He closed his eyes briefly. Images from his past rushed in conference rooms where his ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else. Airports where he was questioned twice as long at security. Hotel lobbies where clerks assumed he couldn't possibly be a guest in the executive suite. Those memories weren't abstract. They were scars. Each one whispered now, echoing Richard's words, "You don't belong here." Jonathan pressed his palm against his thigh, grounding himself. He repeated silently, "I belong. I earned this. I will not shrink to fit their vision of me." The safety demonstration played overhead. A flight attendant mimed the motions with oxygen masks and seat belts. Jonathan forced himself to focus on the voice, the gestures, the routine calm of it all. Planes had always fascinated him. As a boy, he used to sit by the airport fence, watching jets lift into the sky, dreaming of the places they carried people. For him, flying had always meant possibility. Yet here he was, in first class, surrounded by luxury he rarely allowed himself. And still he felt like he was on trial. The man behind him coughed softly. Another passenger clicked open a laptop, keys tapping like rain. Jonathan wondered if they, too, had doubted his presence. Did they think he was a fraud, sneaking into a space not meant for him? Or did they quietly admire the way he carried himself? He would never know. And perhaps that was the hardest part, the silence of others, the complicity of those who watched and chose not to speak. Richard cleared his throat across the aisle. "So," he said loudly, pretending to address no one in particular, "some people just think money grows on trees. Don't they get handed things they didn't earn?" His voice carried, deliberate. Jonathan kept his gaze fixed on the seatback screen. He would not give Richard the satisfaction of a response. Not here, not now, but inside. His jaw tightened. His hands curled slightly into fists before he released them. He reminded himself he had a keynote waiting in New York. He had a company employing dozens of bright minds. He had technology that could save lives. That was his truth. Richard's words could not erase it. As the plane lifted off, engines roaring, Jonathan felt the familiar pull of gravity pressing him back. He always loved that moment, the instant when earth gave way to sky, when possibility outweighed weight. He breathed in deeply, let it steady him. Outside, the city of Los Angeles shrank beneath scattered clouds. The world below looked small, almost fragile. It reminded him that perspective mattered. From above, arguments, stares, whispers, they all seemed tiny. Yet inside, in the small world of this cabin, they still loomed large. He glanced sideways. Richard had already ordered a glass of whiskey, sipping it with the smug ease of entitlement. Jonathan turned back to the window, the glow of sunrise painting the horizon in gold and pink. He let the colors wash over him, a reminder that beauty still existed, even in tense moments. The flight smoothed into cruising altitude. Attendants moved quietly, serving drinks and hot towels. Jonathan unfolded the napkin on his tray, set his water glass carefully upon it, and leaned back. He tried to shift his mind to the conference ahead, to the words he would deliver, the lives his work could touch. Yet a part of him remained locked in the present, in the weight of that seat. This wasn't just leather upholstery and extra legroom. It was a symbol, a battleground. He thought of every young person who might one day watch this story, told whether in a headline, in a conversation, or simply whispered between passengers. He wanted them to see not a man who was shamed into silence, but one who held his ground with quiet dignity. Hours stretched slowly. Jonathan dozed for a while, drifting in and out of shallow sleep. In his dreams, he saw his father again, reaching for his chest, collapsing. He woke with a start, breath quickened, heart pounding. For a moment, He wasn't on a plane. He was back in that living room, 9 years old, helpless. He rubbed his forehead, whispered under his breath, "Not again." He refused to let the memory control him. He had turned that pain into purpose. That was why he built Pulse Tech. That was why he kept going. Richard stirred across the aisle, oblivious. The hum of the engines filled the space. Jonathan leaned back, forced his breathing slow, and let the rhythm of the flight steady him once more. By the time the attendants dimmed the cabin lights for the mid-flight stretch, Jonathan had regained his composure. His eyes traced the outlines of clouds below, glowing silver in the moonlight. He realized something quietly profound. The seat he fought to keep wasn't just for him. It represented everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. That thought steadied him. Whatever else happened on this flight, he would carry that truth. And when the time came, he would prove again that belonging wasn't granted by others. It was claimed by the life you lived. What Jonathan could not know was that very soon, this seat would become the center of more than pride or prejudice. It would become the vantage point from which he would save lives. The silence of 3A was only the beginning. Jonathan Carter sat still in his seat, but his mind was moving through years he thought he had already buried. The dimmed cabin lights, the hush of engines, the isolation of the sky. It all pressed memories out of him like shadows creeping under a door. He remembered being 16, standing in line at a department store. He had saved for months, cutting lawns and delivering newspapers, just to buy a second-hand laptop. The cashier scanned the box and looked at him strangely. Then she asked, loudly enough for others to hear, "Are you sure you can afford this?" Everyone in line turned. Jonathan had nodded silently, sliding wrinkled bills across the counter. It wasn't just the question. It was the assumption. The humiliation lingered longer than the pride of finally owning the computer. That moment carved into him the understanding that dignity could be taken in public, stripped away in a single sentence. Tonight, on this flight, it had happened again. Different setting, same wound. He shifted in his seat, trying to shake the memory. But another surfaced. College, freshman year. A professor had paused after reading his essay aloud, then looked directly at him. "This is excellent," the professor said, voice tinged with surprise. "Who helped you write it?" Jonathan had felt the room grow smaller, all eyes turning toward him. He remembered swallowing the sting and answering softly, "No one. It was me." He carried that essay back to his dorm and sat on the bed, staring at the A+ scrawled in red ink. The grade didn't erase the disbelief. Even when he excelled, the world asked if it was really his. He pressed his fingers lightly against the armrest now, grounding himself in the present. The hum of the engine steadied, but his chest remained tight. These weren't just memories. They were scars unseen, but heavy. Jonathan turned his gaze to the dark window. The reflection stared back broad shoulders, steady eyes, a man who had built something from nothing. Yet behind the reflection, clouds blurred past, shapeless, untouchable. That was how prejudice felt, something you couldn't grasp. But that blurred everything you looked through inside him. A quiet question rose. Why do I still let this cut me? Why, after everything I've achieved, do I still feel their words? He didn't answer immediately. Maybe because he was human. Because scars don't vanish. They live under the skin, waiting for the right light to show them again. He thought of his employees at Pulse Tech, young engineers, researchers, many of them minorities themselves. They looked at him with admiration, not just for his leadership, but for his presence, for being someone who looked like them and had carved a path where few had walked. He couldn't afford to crumble under Richard Coleman's smirk or Emily Dawson's clipped politeness. Too many people depended on him. And yet, sitting there in 3A, he admitted silently he was tired. Tired of fighting battles no one else even saw. Tired of proving worth in spaces where his ticket, his credentials, his very existence should have been proof enough. The seatbelt light blinked on with a soft chime. A patch of turbulence shook the plane gently. Cups rattling on trays. Jonathan exhaled and leaned back. The movement of the aircraft reminded him of something his father once told him when he was a boy. Planes hit bumps. Son, doesn't mean they're falling. Just means the air is rougher in some places. Jonathan had laughed then, a child clutching his father's hand on his first flight. Now, years later, he heard those words echo again. Rough air didn't mean falling. Rough moments didn't mean he didn't belong, but belonging, that word always cut deeper than others. At board meetings, when his title was read aloud, he watched faces shift, surprise flicker, calculations rearrange behind polished smiles. At restaurants, he noticed when the check was handed to his white colleagues instead of him. At hotels, he caught the hesitation before his card was swiped. Each moment small, each wound quiet, but together they built a weight he carried into every room, every flight, every seat. Jonathan rubbed his temples. He wondered if Richard Coleman even thought twice about his words. Perhaps Richard had already forgotten, sipping his whiskey, scrolling his emails. That was the cruelty of it, the offender forgets. The scarred remember. He leaned his head back, eyes half closed, and drifted into another memory. This one brighter. Graduation day at Johns Hopkins. His mother in the crowd, clapping furiously, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had worn her best dress, a simple floral print she had saved for special occasions. She didn't need words. Her pride radiated. After the ceremony, she had held his face in her hands and said, "You will walk into rooms they never thought you'd enter. And when they look at you like you don't belong, remember you already do." That memory steadied him. It was a scar, too, but a healing one. A reminder that love and faith could be stronger than doubt. Jonathan opened his laptop, more out of habit than need. The glow lit his face in the dim cabin. He pulled up his slides for the conference. Charts, diagrams, patient testimonials. Each word, each image was proof of his work, of the lives already saved. He let the data calm him, numbers lining up neatly in contrast to the chaos of prejudice. But beneath the surface, the storm hadn't fully settled. He wondered, what if I had stayed quiet at the gate? What if I had given up the seat just to avoid conflict? The thought chilled him. If he had surrendered, Richard would have sat here, satisfied, while Jonathan disappeared into coach, invisible once again, and maybe no one would ever know. But then another thought surfaced, sharper. If I had given up, what would that have taught me about myself, about my worth? He shook his head softly. No, this time he hadn't moved. He had kept his seat. And perhaps that choice would matter in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The cabin grew quieter as passengers settled into sleep. The only sounds were the drone of engines and the occasional clink of glasses. Jonathan rested his chin on his hand, staring out into the darkness. For a fleeting moment, he imagined telling this story one day, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a testament to resilience. He pictured standing on a stage, his voice steady, saying, "They tried to take my seat, but I stayed, and because I stayed, I was there when I was needed." The thought gave him peace. Not victory, not triumph, just peace. He closed his laptop, folded his hands, and let the hum of the flight lull him into reflection. His scars were still there, yes, but they were part of him. They told his story. They reminded him of where he came from, of what he had endured. And maybe, just maybe, they were preparing him for what was coming. Because the real test of belonging wasn't in silence or stares. It was in what you did. When the moment demanded more than dignity, it demanded action. Jonathan didn't know yet that moment was close, but he felt it, like the shift in the air before a storm. The plane had settled into the long stillness of cruising altitude. The hum of the engines was steady, like background music in a restless dream. Some passengers slept with neck pillows pressed against windows. Others tapped on laptops or scrolled through glowing screens. The cabin lights were dimmed, a soft twilight that wrapped the first-class cabin in a hushed calm. Jonathan Carter sat with his hands folded, watching clouds drift below. For a moment, the silence felt almost soothing, a fragile reprieve after the humiliation at boarding. He told himself to breathe, to focus on the hours ahead, the conference waiting in New York. Then it happened. A gasp, a thud, the sharp sound of a tray tipping over. Jonathan turned. 2 rows behind, an elderly woman clutched her chest, her face pale and strained. The water glass she had been holding spilled across her lap as her body slumped sideways. A man beside her shouted, "Somebody help! She's not breathing right." The calm of the cabin shattered. Passengers stirred. Attendants rushed down the aisle. Jonathan's chest tightened. Instinct pushed him to stand. The woman was Grace Miller, 70 years old, traveling alone. Her eyes fluttered. Her lips tinged blue. The man next to her shook with panic. She said her heart felt strange. Then she just collapsed. Emily Dawson, the flight attendant, was the first to arrive. She crouched beside Grace, fumbling with the radio to call the cockpit. Another attendant hurried forward with the medical kit. "We need the AED," Emily barked. The defibrillator appeared moments later. A bright red case snapped open with urgency. But when the device powered on, a warning beep filled the air. Error. System malfunction. Emily's eyes widened. She tried again. Same error. The machine was useless. Passengers gasped. A ripple of fear spread like electricity through the cabin. Jonathan had already moved down the aisle, kneeling beside Grace. "I'm trained," he said firmly, his voice low but steady. "Medical background. I can help." Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking between him and the broken device. Doubt lingered, sharp and familiar. He had seen that doubt before in classrooms, in boardrooms, in strangers' eyes when he introduced himself as CEO. Now, in this moment, it burned like a spotlight. "Please," Jonathan pressed, looking directly at her. "Every second matters." The man beside Grace cried out, "Let him try." "She's dying," Emily swallowed, her lips pressed tight, then gave a curt nod. "Do what you can." Jonathan leaned over Grace, his hands precise, controlled. He checked her airway, her pulse faint, erratic. Her chest barely rose. He remembered his father collapsing years ago, the helplessness of watching life slip away. He would not let that happen again. "Ma'am, stay with me," he murmured, as if his voice could anchor her. He tilted her head back, began compressions, firm, steady, measured. 30 presses, 2 breaths. He had done this countless times in training, in trials for Pulse-Tech's devices. But this was no lab. This was life balanced on his hands. Around him, the cabin was silent except for his voice-counting compressions. The wheeze of air forced into Grace's lungs. The nervous shifting of passengers watching. Every pair of eyes was on him now. The man they had doubted, humiliated, sidelined. He was their only hope. Minutes stretched. Sweat dotted Jonathan's brow, his muscles burning from the relentless rhythm of CPR. He refused to stop. Then a gasp. Grace's chest heaved. Her eyes flickered open, unfocused but alive. A weak cough rattled from her throat. Jonathan leaned back, exhaling, relief flooding him. He steadied her, speaking softly. "You're okay? Stay calm. Help is here." The cabin erupted in whispers of shock and awe. The man beside Grace sobbed with gratitude. A woman across the aisle pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Even Emily, still crouched nearby, stared at Jonathan with wide eyes. For once, there was no doubt in her expression, only recognition. Grace was stabilized, oxygen mask secured, pulse weak but steady. Attendants moved her carefully to lie flat across 2 seats. Jonathan stayed until he was sure she was breathing evenly, then slowly rose. His arms trembled, but his face remained composed. He walked back to 3A, each step deliberate. The passengers' gazes followed him like a spotlight. Some murmured thanks, some nodded quietly. Even Richard Coleman, still across the aisle, had lowered his phone. His expression was unreadable, but the smugness was gone. Jonathan sank into his seat, leaned back, and closed his eyes. His chest still heaved, not from exhaustion, but from the storm inside. He had just saved a life. He had done what no one else could. And yet, part of him still heard Richard's voice, still felt the sting of being told this seat wasn't his. For a moment, Jonathan wondered if saving Grace would change anything. Would the world see him differently now? Would Emily, Richard, or the quiet passengers whispering in the dark remember him as the man who didn't belong, or the man who gave breath back to a dying woman? He didn't know. What he did know was this: the choice to act had been his alone. No permission could give him that. No prejudice could take it away. Jonathan Carter had stepped forward when others froze. That was who he was. That was who he had always been. And though the cabin had quieted again, though the hum of the engines returned, Jonathan felt it in his bones. This was only the beginning. The flight wasn't over, and neither was his test. Grace Miller's breaths came shallow, each one fragile as paper. The oxygen mask helped, but her pulse still faltered. Jonathan Carter remained crouched at her side, unwilling to let go. His shirt clung with sweat. His arms burned from compressions, but his mind stayed sharp. He had been here before, not on a plane, not in front of dozens of staring eyes, but in simulations, in labs, in hospital trials where Pulse-Tech tested devices designed for this exact moment. Only now, there was no machine to rely on, only his knowledge, only his hands. Emily Dawson hovered close, clutching the useless AED as if hoping it might spring back to life. Her voice was thin. Is she stable? Jonathan didn't look up. Not enough. Her heart still irregular. He tapped his temple, thinking fast. We can't wait. If she slips again, CPR won't be enough. The man seated beside Grace choked back tears. Please, whatever you need to do, do it. Jonathan scanned the medical kit. Gauze, syringes, a stethoscope. Basic tools. Not what he wished for, but enough to improvise. He pressed the stethoscope to Grace's chest, listening carefully. The rhythm stuttered, uneven, like a drum losing its beat. He spoke calmly, half to the attendants, half to himself. "She's in ventricular fibrillation. Her heart's misfiring. Without defibrillation, the chances drop every minute," Emily whispered. But the AED Jonathan cut in, gentle but firm. "Then we create another way." Passengers leaned forward, whispering nervously. Some pulled out phones, though there was no signal this high. Richard Coleman stared across the aisle, his face pale, his whiskey forgotten. Jonathan closed his eyes for a second, calling up memory. Months ago, during a PulseTech trial, one of their prototypes failed mid-simulation. He had improvised then, too. Rerouting current from a laptop battery to trigger a pulse, it had worked in theory. Could it work here? He opened his eyes. "I need a power source. Something portable, strong enough to deliver a jolt." A young man 2 rows back raised his hand. "I've got a laptop. High-capacity battery." Jonathan nodded quickly. "Perfect. Bring it here." The laptop appeared in seconds, handed over like a lifeline. Jonathan moved with precision, stripping wires from the AED's case, connecting them to the battery. His fingers worked quickly, steady despite the weight of dozens of eyes. He had done things like this before, but never with so much at stake. Emily knelt beside him, her voice low. "Are you sure this is safe?" Jonathan met her gaze. Nothing is safe when a heart stops. But this gives her a chance. He placed the modified pads on Grace's chest. Careful, exact. "Clear space," he ordered, his tone commanding. "No one touch her." The passengers leaned back, breaths held, silence pressed against the cabin walls. Jonathan pressed the improvised trigger. A small spark of current leapt through the wires. Grace's body jolted slightly, her chest rising. For a second, nothing happened. Then her pulse steadied. The stutter smoothed into rhythm. Weak, but real. Life returned to her cheeks, color spreading slowly. Her eyes fluttered open again, this time less clouded, more present. A faint whisper escaped her lips. "Thank you." Relief swept through the cabin like a wave. Gasps, murmurs, even soft applause broke the tension. The man beside Grace clutched Jonathan's arm, sobbing. "You saved her. You really saved her." Emily's eyes glistened, her professional mask slipping. She whispered, almost to herself, "My God." Jonathan exhaled deeply, his shoulders finally dropping. He carefully disconnected the wires, leaving Grace resting with steady breaths under the oxygen mask. He checked her pulse again, confirming. Stable. He rose slowly, legs stiff, arms heavy. Passengers stared as he walked back to his seat, not with doubt now, but with awe. Some nodded, some murmured thanks, others simply looked at him differently, seeing not just a black man in a seat they thought he didn't deserve, but the one person who had saved a life when all else failed. Richard Coleman avoided his gaze, but the smugness was gone, replaced with something Jonathan recognized: shame. Jonathan sat in 3A, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but his mind was clear. He had proven himself not with words, not with arguments, but with action. Proof lay in Grace Miller's steady breaths behind him. The cabin slowly returned to quiet. Attendants checked on Grace regularly, offering blankets, adjusting her oxygen. Passengers settled, though the energy in the room was changed. There was reverence in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had all witnessed something extraordinary. Jonathan kept to himself, sipping water, wiping his damp forehead with a napkin. He didn't seek gratitude, though whispers floated around him. He's incredible. What if he hadn't been here first class or not? That man belongs. But Jonathan knew better than to think one act could erase a lifetime of prejudice. He knew the world had a way of forgetting, of sliding back into old habits once the crisis passed. Still, for this moment, he allowed himself to breathe easier. Emily approached quietly. She paused beside his seat, cleared her throat, and spoke softly. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology. I doubted you when I shouldn't have. You didn't just save her life. You reminded me what it means to trust." Jonathan looked up at her, his expression calm but unreadable. He gave a small nod. People doubt until they don't have a choice. That's the world we live in. Emily swallowed hard, then whispered, "Maybe it doesn't have to be." She moved on, leaving Jonathan with the weight of her words. Hours later, as the cabin lights dimmed again and passengers drifted back into uneasy sleep, Jonathan stared at the window, watching stars scatter across the sky. His muscles still ached. His mind still replayed the scene, the gasp, the silence, the shock of current, the return of life. He thought of his father again, of the day his heart failed. If someone like him had been there then, with knowledge and courage, maybe things would have been different. Maybe his father would have lived. The thought cut deep, but it also carried light. Tonight, he had given someone else what his father never had: another heartbeat. And deep down, Jonathan knew this was only the first test, because life had a way of stacking trials, and the skies above them were not yet done shaking. The cabin felt different now. The air itself seemed changed, heavier with unspoken awe. Conversations had dropped to whispers, movements slower, more deliberate. It was as if everyone on board had silently agreed that the ordinary rules of flying no longer applied. They had witnessed something raw, something that peeled away the thin curtain of routine. Jonathan Carter sat in 3A, his body drained, but his mind alive. He could still feel the imprint of compressions in his arms, the rhythm of counting in his head, the moment when Grace's pulse had steadied under his hands. That memory pulsed in him like an echo, steady, undeniable. Grace now lay reclined across 2 seats, a blanket pulled over her legs, oxygen mask snug against her face. Her breathing was even, the rise and fall of her chest almost melodic. Every so often, a flight attendant leaned in to check her pulse, whispering reassurance. Passengers nearby glanced at her with relief, but their eyes inevitably wandered back to Jonathan. He felt it, the shift in their gaze. Earlier, they had looked at him with suspicion, doubt, even disdain. Now, their eyes carried something else: respect, gratitude, maybe even wonder. Emily Dawson approached again, moving slower this time, her posture softer. She knelt beside Jonathan's seat, her voice low so others wouldn't overhear. "I wanted to thank you again," she said. "What you did, I've never seen anything like it." Jonathan tilted his head, studying her face. She wasn't just offering courtesy now. She was wrestling with something deeper. Guilt, maybe. Recognition. "You almost didn't let me try," Jonathan said quietly. His tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. Emily's eyes flickered. She lowered them for a moment, then met his gaze. "You're right. I doubted you, and that could have cost a life. I don't have an excuse for that." Jonathan leaned back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't interested in humiliating her or in hearing rehearsed apologies. He simply nodded. You made a choice in the moment. What matters is, next time, you remember this one. Emily's eyes softened. She placed a hand over the seat back, steadying herself, then whispered, I will. And then she rose and moved on. But Jonathan knew the conversation would linger with her long after this flight. Richard Coleman, however, remained silent. He sat across the aisle, rigid, staring at the window though his reflection betrayed his unease. His phone sat idle in his lap. He hadn't touched his whiskey since Grace collapsed. Jonathan caught Richard's glance once. The man's lips parted, as if he wanted to speak, but then he looked away quickly, his jaw tight. Shame was not something Richard wore easily, but Jonathan saw it there, flickering beneath the surface. Jonathan didn't press. He had no need to. Sometimes silence carried more weight than words. Hours slipped by. The attendants dimmed the lights again, encouraging passengers to rest. The hum of the engines filled the quiet, a steady backdrop. Some people slept, though their bodies shifted uneasily as if dreams were heavier tonight. Others sat awake, staring into the dark, their minds replaying the scene they had just witnessed. Jonathan sat with his laptop closed, hands folded. He didn't need screens or slides right now. He needed stillness. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself a small smile, not of pride, but of relief. He had acted when it counted. He had been there when someone needed him most. And in that moment, no doubt, no prejudice, no stolen seat could erase the truth he had saved a life. Yet beneath the calm, another current stirred. He knew too well that moments like these didn't always rewrite the world. The applause faded, the gratitude dimmed, and prejudice had a way of creeping back, like weeds through cracked pavement. He had lived long enough to know respect could be conditional, fragile, revoked at the first convenience. Still, he couldn't deny the shift in the cabin tonight. Even if temporary, it mattered. For Grace, for the man who cried at her side, for the passengers who now saw what was possible when judgment gave way to trust. Jonathan leaned back, let his eyes close briefly. His mind drifted, not to the humiliation at boarding, but to his mother's voice again, firm yet gentle. Jonathan, you don't need to fight every battle with words. Sometimes your actions will shout louder than any defense. Tonight, those actions had spoken loudly. Grace stirred faintly, murmuring something through her oxygen mask. Jonathan opened his eyes and turned. She blinked, her gaze finding him. She lifted a trembling hand, gesturing toward him. Jonathan rose, walked back to her side. Her voice was hoarse, but clear enough. You gave me back my breath. Jonathan smiled softly. You gave it back yourself. I just reminded your heart how to find the rhythm again. Her lips curved in a faint smile, tears welling at the corners of her eyes. She squeezed his hand weakly. Don't let anyone ever tell you you don't belong. People like you belong everywhere. The words hit him harder than he expected. He swallowed, nodding once. Rest now. You'll be okay. She drifted back to sleep, still holding his hand loosely until it slipped away. Jonathan returned to his seat, his chest heavier with something more than fatigue. The night stretched on. Passengers dozed. The sky outside was dark, studded with stars that shimmered like distant cities. Jonathan stared out the window, his reflection merging with the endless sky. He thought about belonging, about scars, about the strange way life demanded proof from him again and again. Tonight, He had offered proof in the most undeniable form, a heartbeat revived. But a thought gnawed at him. Saving grace had been only the first test. He didn't know why, but deep inside, he felt it. The air carried a tension he couldn't explain, as if the plane itself held its breath. And Jonathan Carter knew that sometimes life didn't wait long before asking more of you. The cabin had finally grown still again. Passengers drifted into uneasy sleep, their breaths soft, their bodies sagging against pillows and headrests. Grace Miller's breathing was steady now, her chest rising and falling beneath the oxygen mask. Jonathan Carter allowed himself a long, slow exhale, as if maybe, just maybe, the night had given him a reprieve. Then the plane shuddered. It began with a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, followed by a sudden lurch that sent cups rattling, ice cubes scattering across trays. A chorus of gasps echoed through the cabin. Jonathan's eyes snapped open. His instincts sharpened. The next sound froze every heart on board. A sharp hiss, loud and terrifying, ripped through the air vents. In seconds, the oxygen mask dropped from overhead, dangling like eerie marionettes. Jonathan's pulse spiked. He knew what this meant. Loss of cabin pressure. The attendants rushed down the aisle, their voices raised above the chaos. "Masks on everyone! Put your mask on now!" Panic broke out instantly. Passengers scrambled, fumbling with elastic straps, tugging at masks, shouting over one another. Some children cried. A man swore loudly as he tried to help his wife secure hers. Jonathan grabbed the mask above him, pulled it down firmly, and secured it over his face. His breath sounded mechanical, shallow, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned and helped the woman in the seat beside him, steadying her trembling hands until the mask covered her mouth and nose. Across the aisle, Richard Coleman was pale, his mask crooked. Jonathan resisted the urge to look away. He reached across, adjusted it quickly, and nodded once. Richard's eyes met his for a fleeting second, filled not with smugness this time, but raw fear. A piercing ding crackled through the speakers. Then the voice of Captain Harris came, calm but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've experienced a rapid decompression event. We are descending to a safe altitude. Please remain calm and keep your masks on." The plane tilted downward, nose angling sharply. Gravity pressed passengers into their seats, stomachs flipping with the sudden descent. The sound of the wind outside roared like an angry sea. Jonathan gripped the armrests, steady but alert. He knew enough about aviation medicine to understand the stakes. At high altitudes, without pressure, oxygen levels plummeted. Hypoxia set in fast. Minutes could mean the difference between life and death. A flight attendant stumbled down the aisle, shouting above the din, "We need assistance in the back. A group of passengers is trapped. The emergency door won't release." Jonathan's head snapped up. His mind raced. He pictured the design of aircraft doors, the pressure seals, the locking mechanisms. He remembered an elective course he had taken years ago on aerospace physiology, a choice most of his peers thought odd. But Jonathan had been fascinated by how the human body reacted in the skies. That curiosity had armed him with knowledge now rushing back in fragments. He unbuckled his belt. "I can help." Emily Dawson appeared at his side, panic flickering across her face. "You've already done enough." Jonathan cut her off, his voice firm, commanding. "If that door stays sealed, they won't make it. Show me where." Her hesitation lasted only a second. Then she nodded and led the way. The scene at the rear was chaos. Half a dozen passengers clustered around the emergency exit, their masks slipping as they tugged desperately at the lever. A woman pounded on the panel with her fist, screaming. Another passenger slumped against the wall, dizzy from lack of air. The mechanisms jammed. An attendant shouted, "It won't respond." Jonathan scanned quickly, eyes sharp, calculating. The pressure differential wouldn't allow the door to open fully at altitude, but something else was wrong. The manual override, rarely used, often forgotten, was hidden beneath a latch near the floor. He dropped to his knees, pried it open, and saw the lever. He turned to the attendants. "This is the bypass. It disengages the lock manually, but we need to do it carefully, or the door could blow too soon." Emily's voice trembled. "How do you know this?" Jonathan didn't look up. His hands were quickly, steady. "Because I studied it. Because I paid attention when no one thought I should." The plane rattled again, a sharp jolt throwing people against the walls. Gas filled the air. Jonathan braced himself, gritted his teeth, and pulled the lever down hard. For a moment, nothing. Then a heavy clunk reverberated through the door, the lock mechanism releasing. "Try now," Jonathan shouted. 2 attendants pulled at the main handle. This time, it moved, not fully, but enough to unseal the jam, enough to free the trapped passengers. They stumbled out into the aisle, coughing into their masks, tears streaking their faces. Relief rippled through the group, a desperate chorus of thank yous and sobs. Jonathan steadied one man who nearly collapsed, guiding him to a seat. His muscles trembled from effort, but his focus remained razor-sharp. Captain Harris's voice returned through the intercom. "We've reached a safer altitude. Oxygen levels are stabilizing. Keep your masks on until instructed otherwise." The roar outside softened slightly as the plane leveled. Passengers began to breathe easier, their panic slowly subsiding into shaky silence. Jonathan pulled his mask away briefly, testing the air, thin but survivable. He nodded to the attendants, signaling that the worst had passed. Emily looked at him, eyes wide, voice barely a whisper. "You just saved them. Again." Jonathan shook his head. "No. Knowledge did. I just carried it." But inside, he felt the weight of what had happened. Twice now, on a single flight, he had stood between life and death. Twice, he had proven himself when doubt surrounded him. And still, he wondered, would it be enough? Jonathan returned slowly to his seat in 3A. Passengers watched him, their eyes different now, not skeptical, not dismissive, but changed. Some nodded silently as he passed. Others reached out to touch his arm, murmuring thanks. He sat, pulled his mask fully away, and stared out the window at the endless black sky. The stars seemed sharper now, brighter against the void. Richard Coleman's voice came, quiet, hesitant. "You knew exactly what to do." Jonathan turned his head slightly, met Richard's eyes. There was no arrogance there now, only vulnerability, fear, and maybe, finally, respect. Jonathan didn't reply. He simply leaned back, his silence louder than any words. The cabin settled again, though the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Gratitude buzzed unspoken. Relief lingered like a shared secret. And somewhere in the darkness, above the Atlantic, Jonathan Carter knew this wasn't the end. The night had tested him once more. But the sky, it seemed, wasn't done yet. The cabin had grown quiet again, but it wasn't the calm of routine. It was the silence that follows chaos, the silence of people realizing just how fragile their lives had been moments ago. Jonathan Carter sat back in 3A, his chest still heaving from the rush of adrenaline. His shirt clung damp against his skin. His muscles ached from exertion. Outside, the night sky stretched black and endless, stars scattered like shattered glass. He should have felt relief. They had survived the decompression. The masts had come down. The door had been freed, and the captain had steadied the plane. But inside Jonathan, a storm raged, because he knew this wasn't over. His mind flashed back to his university days at Johns Hopkins. He remembered slipping into an elective course on aerospace physiology, a class he had no reason to take. His advisor had frowned. "Jonathan, your focus is cardiology. Why waste time with this?" But Jonathan had felt a pull, because one day, medicine won't just be on the ground. He'd answered, "People fly, people live in the sky, and hearts still fail up there." He remembered late nights poring over diagrams of aircraft pressurization systems, studying how oxygen levels plummeted at altitude, how hypoxia crept in unnoticed, stealing clarity and strength. He remembered running simulations, fumbling at first, then mastering the mechanics of emergency overrides. At the time, he had wondered if he was chasing curiosity for curiosity's sake. Now, sitting at 34,000 feet, he realized those choices were not accidents. They were preparation. Still, knowledge wasn't comfort. Not now. Jonathan closed his eyes, pressing his palms together in front of him like a man at prayer. His thoughts spun. "I've done enough already. I saved Grace. I helped open the door. Isn't that enough?" But the answer came swiftly, relentless. "No, not if something worse comes. Not if the crew falters again. Not if they look at you, and you're the only one who knows what to do." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, heavier than the pressurized air. He wasn't part of the crew. He wasn't trained for this role. He was a passenger, a CEO, someone who had bought a ticket like everyone else. And yet, tonight, every test had cornered him, asking for more. Across the aisle, Richard Coleman shifted in his seat. His face was pale, his mask now dangling useless around his neck. He kept sneaking glances at Jonathan, opening his mouth as if to speak, then stopping. Jonathan could almost hear the words unsaid. "How do you know these things? Why you, of all people?" Jonathan turned away, unwilling to entertain Richard's curiosity. But inside, another voice echoed, "Why me?" He thought of his father again, the day his heart had failed. He thought of his mother's tired smile after night shifts, the sacrifices she bore. He thought of every time he had been doubted, dismissed, reduced to less than what he was, and he realized every one of those moments had been shaping him for this. The attendants huddled near the galley, their voices urgent but hushed. Jonathan caught fragments. "System alert. Cockpit needs assistance. Manual reset." His ears sharpened. Something was wrong beyond the decompression. He rose, walked toward them. Emily Dawson looked up, startled. "Mr. Carter, please, sit down. It's under control." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "If it were under control, you wouldn't be whispering like that." Emily hesitated. The other attendant looked at her, uncertain. Finally, Emily sighed. "The captain says one of the pressure valves isn't responding. If it doesn't reset, we can't stabilize fully for landing." Jonathan's pulse quickened. He knew that system. He had studied it in diagrams years ago. A faulty valve could lead to another decompression, or worse. "Do you know how to reset it manually?" Jonathan asked. Emily's silence was the answer. Jonathan's throat went dry. He felt the old battle rising inside him. If I step forward again, I risk everything. If I fail, they'll blame me. They'll say I overstepped, that I never belonged in the first place. But another voice cut through. And if you stay silent, then lives are lost. Again, he returned to his seat, gripping the armrests as if anchoring himself. His thoughts swirled, heavy, relentless. You've been here before, Jonathan, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in seats where they told you you didn't belong. Every time, you had to prove yourself. Every time, the price of silence was higher than the sting of doubt. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from memory. He pictured his employees, their bright young faces, looking to him for leadership. He pictured his mother's words, "Never give them your temper. Show them your dignity." Tonight, dignity wasn't enough. Tonight demanded action. The plane jolted again, sending a ripple of fear through the cabin. A woman cried out, clutching her child. Grace stirred weakly, murmuring under her mask. The sound cut into Jonathan's heart. He closed his eyes. If I fail, I'll carry it forever. If I succeed, maybe they'll finally see me. Not as a man out of place, but as someone who belonged exactly where he was meant to be. The storm inside him stilled. Resolve replaced fear. He opened his eyes, sharp, steady. Jonathan Carter had made his decision. He rose once more, walking toward the galley where Emily stood frozen with uncertainty. His voice was clear, steady, unwavering. "Take me to the cockpit," he said. Emily blinked. Sir Jonathan's gaze held hers, unflinching. "You know I'm the only one on this plane who understands what that system needs. You've seen what happens when I act. Now trust me, or you risk everyone on board." Silence hung for a moment. Then, slowly, Emily nodded. The weight of the cabin seemed to shift, as if the entire plane leaned toward his choice. Jonathan didn't know what awaited behind the cockpit door, but he knew one thing: he was done letting others decide where he belonged. This time, he would claim his place not just for himself, but for everyone whose lives hung in the balance. The aisle seemed longer than ever as Jonathan Carter walked behind Emily Dawson toward the cockpit. Each step echoed in his chest, heavier than the last. He could feel passengers' eyes trailing him, some wide with hope, some clouded with fear, others with disbelief. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Even the engines, steady as a heartbeat, seemed to fade beneath the weight of anticipation. Every passenger knew something was wrong. And now, they were watching the man who hours ago had nearly been denied his seat become their last, fragile chance. Jonathan kept his gaze forward. He had no space for their doubts anymore. He had spent his entire life carrying them, and tonight he was done bending under their weight. At the front of the plane, Emily stopped just short of the cockpit door. She turned to Jonathan, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. "The captain is under enormous stress," she whispered. "He's not going to like this." Jonathan's voice was calm but unyielding. "I don't need him to like it. I need him to listen." Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the passengers behind them. She lowered her voice further. "Do you understand what you're stepping into? If anything goes wrong, if you're wrong, they won't just blame the plane. They'll blame you." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He knew. He had always known. Failure didn't carry the same price for him as it did for others. For him, failure meant vindication for every prejudice, every whispered slur, every dismissive look. Failure meant proving his doubters right. but he had already made his choice. "If I don't step in," he said softly, "there won't be anyone left to blame." Emily studied him, searching his face for hesitation, but there was none. At last, she nodded, tapping on the cockpit door. Inside, the cockpit was dim, awash in the glow of instruments. Captain Harris sat hunched over the controls, sweat glistening on his forehead. His co-pilot's hands moved frantically over switches, trying to stabilize the system. Warning lights blinked like angry stars across the panel. The captain looked up sharply as Emily entered, Jonathan at her side. His voice was edged with strain. "What is this passengers aren't allowed in here?" Emily swallowed. "Captain, this is Jonathan Carter. I don't care who he is." Harris snapped. "Get him out." Jonathan stepped forward, his voice steady, cutting through the chaos. "You're losing pressure because your outflow valve is jammed. The reset hasn't engaged." "Has it?" The cockpit fell silent for a heartbeat. Harris's eyes narrowed. "How the hell would you know that?" "Because I studied it," Jonathan replied evenly. "Because I've been in simulations where that exact failure happened. And because if you keep fighting the wrong system, this plane won't make it to New York." Harris's jaw clenched. His pride bristled, the authority of his uniform rising against the audacity of a passenger. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He met the captain's gaze with the same steady force he used in boardrooms, in negotiations where everything was at stake. "You don't have to trust me," Jonathan said, "but you do have to ask yourself what happens if I'm right, and you ignore me." The co-pilot glanced between them, his brow furrowed. Finally, he spoke. "Captain, he's not wrong. The valve isn't responding. We've been trying to bypass it for 15 minutes. Harris slammed a hand against the armrest. Frustration etched into his features. He turned to Jonathan, his eyes sharp. "And you think you can fix it?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Yes, with your permission." For a long moment, Harris said nothing. The cockpit vibrated with tension, the low hum of alarms filling the silence. "Finally!" The captain exhaled sharply through his nose. "Fine. But hear me. Carter, if you screw this up, we all go down." Jonathan gave a single nod. "Then let's not screw it up." Emily watched, her chest tight, as Jonathan leaned over the instrument panel. His hands moved carefully, tracing the outlines of switches and levers as if reacquainting himself with an old map. He muttered under his breath, recalling diagrams, technical notes, training sessions from years ago. He pointed. "There, that's the manual reset access. It's beneath the auxiliary panel. You've been bypassing the wrong circuit." The co-pilot's eyes widened. "He's right." Jonathan met Harris's gaze again. "Give me 30 seconds. That's all I need." The captain hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Do it." Jonathan crouched, opening the auxiliary panel with swift precision. His fingers trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the gravity of the moment. He could feel the cabin behind him, hundreds of lives tethered to every move he made. This is it, he thought. The moment they'll remember. The moment that either proves everything I've ever fought for or destroys it forever. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of history. His father's silence, his mother's resilience, every scar of doubt carved into him, they all converged here. He adjusted the switch, his breath steady, his mind razor sharp. "Behind him," Emily whispered. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe them anything. Not after the way you were treated." Jonathan paused only briefly, his eyes fixed on the circuit. His voice was low but resolute. "Because it's not about owing. It's about living with myself when this is over. And with that, he pulled the lever. The instruments flickered. A series of warning lights blinked, then stilled. The hiss of escaping pressure quieted, replaced by the steady hum of stabilizing systems. The cabin above began to ease, oxygen levels balancing, the air no longer thin and sharp. Harris's eyes darted over the panels, disbelief and relief colliding, system stabilizing, cabin pressure normalizing. The co-pilot let out a shaky laugh. He did it. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. He rose, brushing his palms against his thighs, and looked at Harris. "Now get us home," he said simply, as Emily led him back into the cabin. The passengers looked up, their eyes wide, their bodies tense with the residue of fear. Jonathan walked slowly, steadily, back toward his seat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The hush that followed him was louder than applause. For the first time that night, Jonathan Carter felt something unfamiliar, not doubt, not anger, not even triumph, belonging. When Jonathan Carter stepped back into the cabin, silence followed him like a shadow. Every eye in first class turned, not with doubt now, but with something heavier, something that bordered on reverence. The man who hours ago had been told his seat did not belong to him had just stabilized the plane itself. He walked slowly, steadily, his posture straight, his eyes calm. He wasn't seeking applause. He wasn't seeking recognition. He only wanted to sit down, to breathe, to reclaim a moment of quiet in the storm. But the cabin wouldn't let him disappear. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, whispering to each other, their voices trembling with awe. A woman clutched her husband's hand tightly, tears shining in her eyes. A young man mouthed the words "thank you" as Jonathan passed. Even children, eyes wide and unblinking, followed his every step as though he were a figure from a story they would tell years later. Jonathan slid into 3A, pressing his palms against his thighs, grounding himself. His heart pounded, not with fear now, but with the heavy release of adrenaline. He drew a slow breath, leaned back, and closed his eyes. For a fleeting moment, he thought of his mother. He pictured her smile, tired yet radiant, the way she had looked at him on graduation day. He imagined what she would say now, not praise. She was never one to gild words, but something simple, steady. You did what you had to do. That thought anchored him. Across the aisle, Richard Coleman sat stiff, his face ghostly pale. He hadn't spoken since the decompression. He hadn't lifted his phone, hadn't touched the glass of whiskey sweating on his tray. Instead, he stared at Jonathan with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. How did you know what to do?" Jonathan opened his eyes, turned his head slightly, and met Richard's gaze. His tone was calm, almost gentle. "Because I've spent my life preparing for moments no one thought I'd face." Richard swallowed, his throat bobbing. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together. For once, there was no arrogance in his voice, only honesty. "I misjudged you." Jonathan held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Yes, you did." He didn't add more. He didn't soften the truth with forgiveness. Some lessons were meant to sting. A murmur rippled through the cabin as other passengers leaned toward Richard, whispering about the earlier scene at boarding. Several pairs of eyes turned on him now. Not Jonathan. The balance of judgment had shifted. Jonathan felt no satisfaction in Richard's discomfort. He didn't need Richard's humiliation to validate his worth. What mattered was that life itself had already offered the verdict, and it had been undeniable. Still, he saw something shifting in Richard's expression, something fragile and unfinished. Shame, yes, but also the faint glimmer of understanding. Emily Dawson approached quietly, standing beside Jonathan's seat. Her voice was low, her eyes soft. "The captain asked me to thank you. He said we wouldn't be here without you." Jonathan tilted his head toward her, his voice steady. "It wasn't about me. It was about all of us making it home." Emily hesitated, then added, "You should know. The passengers keep asking your name. They want to remember it." Jonathan gave a small, weary smile. "Names don't matter as much as the choice to act when it counts." Emily's throat tightened. She nodded, then moved on, but her steps were slower, her eyes thoughtful. Grace Miller stirred in her reclined seat, her oxygen mask still in place. She lifted a trembling hand, gesturing toward Jonathan. He rose and stepped to her side, kneeling gently. Her voice was faint but clear. "Twice now. You've given us back life." Jonathan smiled softly. "You gave it back to yourself. I just reminded the world how strong you are." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Don't ever let them take your place again. You belong exactly where you choose to stand." Her words cut deep, wrapping around the scars he carried, not erasing them, but softening them. Jonathan bowed his head slightly. "Rest now, Grace. We're going to make it." The hours crawled forward. The plane hummed steadily. The crisis passed for now. Passengers dozed uneasily, some murmuring in their sleep. But Jonathan remained awake, his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the sky stretched endless and dark, dotted with stars. He felt small against its vastness, yet steady in the knowledge that tonight, in this fragile space between earth and heaven, he had been exactly what was needed. Still, a voice inside him whispered, "This isn't over. The sky isn't done with you yet." He pressed his palm against the cool window, watching the stars blur as the plane cut forward. In the silence, Richard's voice broke once more, quiet, almost hesitant. "Jonathan, when we land, if there's ever a chance, I'd like to learn from you." Jonathan turned slightly, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once. "We'll see." The words were neither promise nor rejection. They were a reminder respect was earned, not granted. And Richard had only begun his lesson. Jonathan leaned back again, closing his eyes. His body longed for rest, but his spirit stayed alert. He could feel it in his bones. The flight had tested him. Yes, but the true measure was still ahead. Some storms were mechanical. Others were human. And Jonathan Carter knew both had a way of colliding in the sky. The cabin had fallen into an uneasy quiet. Passengers shifted restlessly in their seats, the glow of overhead lights dimming to a soft haze. The storm seemed behind them. Grace Miller was stable. The decompression resolved. The valve reset. Yet Jonathan Carter could not rest. Something inside him stirred like a warning bell, faint but insistent. He sat in 3A, hands folded, staring at the window. Beyond the glass, the Atlantic stretched endless and black, a void that swallowed light. For the first time since boarding, Jonathan wondered if the sky itself was testing him layer after layer, stripping away doubt, pushing him to the brink of his endurance. Then, as if answering his thought, the plane lurched violently. A chorus of gas broke through the cabin. Drinks spilled, trays clattered to the floor. Oxygen masks swayed overhead, though they had been tucked away again. Passengers clutched their armrests, eyes wide with fear. Jonathan braced himself, his mind snapping back into focus. This wasn't turbulence. The shudder was sharper, harsher, something mechanical. The intercom crackled. Captain Harris's voice tight with strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a hydraulic system failure. Our landing gear may not deploy correctly. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." Panic erupted. A woman cried out, sobbing into her husband's shoulder. A child wailed, clutching a teddy bear. The quiet hum of fear grew into a roar. Jonathan's stomach knotted. A hydraulic failure. He knew what that meant without pressure. The landing gear might jam, leaving the plane skidding helplessly across the runway or worse. Emily Dawson rushed down the aisle, her face pale but composed. She tried to steady panicked passengers, her voice strained but clear. "Please stay seated. We're trained for emergencies. We'll be okay." But Jonathan could see it in her eyes. She didn't believe it. He unbuckled, stood, and caught her arm gently. "Emily, what's the captain's plan?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Manual override. But it's risky. If it doesn't engage, we could—" She trailed off, eyes darting to the terrified passengers. Jonathan's mind raced. He had studied hydraulics once, during a Pulse Tech project involving pressurized medical devices. The principles weren't identical, but they rhymed. He pictured diagrams, fluid systems, redundancies. "Take me to the cockpit," he said again, his voice firmer this time. Emily shook her head. "Jonathan, you've already done enough. You saved Grace. You saved us from decompression. You helped reset the valve. This is different. If something happens in there—" Jonathan cut her off, his voice steady but unyielding. "If I stay here while I know how to help, I'll never forgive myself. Let me try." For a moment, Emily stood frozen, torn between fear and trust. Then she nodded. "Come." The cockpit was chaos. Warning alarms pulsed red across the panels, the co-pilot flipping switches desperately. Captain Harris gripped the controls, sweat streaking his face. He spun when Jonathan entered, his voice sharp. "Not again. I can't babysit a passenger while I try to land this aircraft." Jonathan met his fury with calm resolve. "This isn't about me. It's about giving you options you don't have right now." Harris's jaw tightened. "You think you can land a plane?" "No," Jonathan replied evenly, "but I can help you keep the hydraulics alive long enough to land it yourself." The co-pilot glanced up, eyes wide. "Captain, he might be right. The secondary system's failing. We don't have much time." Harris slammed his fist against the panel, then glared at Jonathan. "Fine. What's your idea?" Jonathan crouched near the auxiliary controls, scanning quickly. He spoke fast, his tone clipped, efficient. "Your hydraulic pressure is bleeding out. But if we reroute flow from the backup reservoir, you can buy enough control to lock the gear manually." The co-pilot blinked. "That's possible." "Yes, but it means isolating one of the stabilizers. You'll lose balance control during descent." Harris cursed under his breath. "Trading balance for wheels." Jonathan's gaze was steady. "It's the only shot you have." The captain's hand shook as he weighed the choice. Then, with a growl, he nodded. "Do it." Jonathan reached for the manual valves, twisting them carefully, feeling the vibrations of the plane respond beneath his palms. He heard the hiss of fluid shifting, the faint groan of gears straining. "Try it now," Jonathan said. The co-pilot pulled the lever for the landing gear. For a moment, nothing, then clunk, a sound that sent relief flooding the cabin floor to ceiling. "Gear engaged," the co-pilot shouted. Jonathan exhaled, his muscles trembling. He steadied himself, meeting Harris's eyes. "Now bring us down." The intercom buzzed. Harris's voice, still rough but steadier now, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, our landing gear is deployed. We are cleared for emergency landing. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." The roar of fear shifted into cries of relief. Some passengers clapped, others wept openly. Jonathan stood silently, bracing himself against the wall, letting the weight of the moment wash over him. Harris turned to him, his voice low, reluctant but honest. "Carter, I don't know how you knew all this, but tonight, you saved my plane." Jonathan gave a small nod. "No, Captain, I helped you save it." As Emily led him back into the cabin, passengers reached out, touching his arm, murmuring thanks. A child lifted her teddy bear as if offering it to him. Jonathan smiled faintly, shaking his head, his heart both heavy and light. When he reached his seat, Richard Coleman stood. His face was pale, his voice unsteady. "Jonathan, I don't have words." Jonathan raised a hand gently, stopping him. "You don't need words, Richard, just choices. Make better ones when we land." Richard swallowed hard, nodding. His eyes glistened with something Jonathan hadn't expected: humility. The plane began its descent, the lights of New York faintly visible on the horizon. Jonathan leaned back, closed his eyes, and exhaled. His body was exhausted, his spirit worn thin, but his heart carried a quiet certainty. He had been tested by humiliation, by doubt, by the very sky itself, and through every trial, he had stood. Whatever came next, Jonathan Carter knew this: he belonged here. The glow of New York shimmered faintly on the horizon, a necklace of lights scattered across the darkness. For hours, the passengers had been suspended between fear and faith, but now the city gleamed like a promise safety was close. Jonathan Carter sat in 3A, his head tilted back, his body exhausted. His hands still bore the ache of CPR compressions, his arms the tremor of twisting hydraulic valves. He had done everything he could. Now, the rest was in the hands of Captain Harris and the runway waiting below. The intercom buzzed. Harris's voice came through, steady but edged with gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for emergency landing at JFK. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened and follow crew instructions." The cabin stirred nervously. Belts clicked, hands gripped armrests. A murmur of prayers rippled quietly. Some whispered, some mouthed silently. Jonathan breathed slowly, grounding himself. He had always believed in preparation, in knowledge, in calm logic. But in this moment, as the city grew closer, he felt the pull of something deeper. Hope. The plane tilted into descent. The engines roared, louder than before, vibrating through the cabin. The lights outside grew sharper, stretching into grids and rivers of gold. Jonathan glanced at Grace Miller. She lay reclined, still wearing her oxygen mask, her hands folded weakly in her lap. When she caught his eye, she lifted one trembling finger, pointing down. Her eyes glistened with tears, her message silent but clear. "We're going to make it." He gave her a small nod, a faint smile breaking through the fatigue. The runway rushed toward them. The cabin held its breath. The wheels touched. A violent shudder ran through the plane, rattling trays, jerking bodies forward against seat belts. For one terrifying second, the aircraft wobbled, tilting slightly as the hydraulics strained. Gaffs erupted, a chorus of fear. Jonathan gripped the armrest, steady as stone. His jaw clenched, but his eyes never left the window. He watched the ground blur past, light streaking into lines. The plane groaned, tires screaming against asphalt, but it held. Finally, mercifully, the plane slowed. The engines eased. The nose lifted slightly, and the rattling subsided into a heavy, trembling roll. They were on the ground. For a moment, silence reigned, a silence so complete it was almost sacred. Then it shattered. Cheers erupted. Applause thundered through the cabin. Some passengers wept openly, clutching one another. Others clapped until their palms stung. Laughter bubbled up, shaky and wild, the sound of people released from the grip of fear. Jonathan sat still, letting the sound wash over him. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He had never cared for applause. But tonight, he understood it wasn't for him alone. It was for survival itself, for the collective relief of lives spared. Emily Dawson moved quickly down the aisle, her professional tone breaking as she tried to steady her own trembling voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until we've reached the gate. Emergency crews are standing by. Thank you for your cooperation." Her eyes caught Jonathan's for a moment. She paused, gave a small nod of respect, then continued. Richard Coleman had not spoken during descent. Now, as the plane slowed to taxi, he turned toward Jonathan. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his voice unsteady. "Jonathan, I don't know how to live with myself after tonight." Jonathan studied him, his gaze calm but firm. "You live with yourself by changing, by remembering what you saw, what you doubted, and choosing better the next time." Richard swallowed hard. He nodded slowly, his hands clasped together tightly. "I will." The words were quiet, but for the first time, they carried weight. As the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, emergency lights flashed outside. Trucks lined the runway, crews waiting to board. Passengers pressed against windows, staring at the flashing beacons like symbols of salvation. Inside, the applause faded into murmurs of gratitude, into the sound of seatbelts unclasping, into shaky laughter and whispered prayers of thanks. Jonathan remained seated, waiting. He wasn't eager to rush into the aisle, to push his way out. He was content to sit, to breathe, to absorb the gravity of what had just unfolded. Grace's voice broke softly through the noise. "Jonathan." He turned to her. She lifted her mask slightly, her lips trembling. "I want my children to know about you, about what you did tonight. They should know people like you exist." Jonathan's throat tightened. He squeezed her hand gently. "Then tell them, not about me, but about what we can do for each other when we choose to act." Her eyes filled with tears. She nodded, closing her eyes again, her hand lingering in his until it slipped away. At last, the door opened. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the sound of sirens, the voices of waiting crews. Passengers filed out slowly, some pausing to touch Jonathan's shoulder, to whisper thanks, to give nods of reverence. He accepted each gesture quietly, humbly, his eyes steady, his voice calm. He didn't need their worship. What mattered was the lives walking past him, alive, whole, breathing. As the aisle cleared, Emily returned, standing beside him. Her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "Jonathan, I don't think I'll ever forget you." He gave a faint smile. "Don't forget yourself. Emily, you were part of this too." Her eyes glistened. She shook her head. "No. Tonight, you reminded us what courage looks like." Jonathan didn't reply. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked slowly toward the open door. The night air hit his face, cool and sharp. Beyond the runway, New York pulsed with light, alive and unbroken. Jonathan drew a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, grounding him. He had been tested, stripped bare, forced to prove his worth again and again. But tonight, as his feet touched solid ground, he carried something new. Not just survival, not just victory, belonging. The cool night air at JFK clung to Jonathan Carter's skin as he stepped onto the tarmac. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft, guiding passengers down the mobile stairs, helping them into waiting buses. Red and blue lights flashed against the fuselage, painting the exhausted faces of travelers with a surreal glow. Jonathan moved slowly, steadying Grace Miller as she descended. Her hand clutched around his arm. Reporters weren't there yet, but phones already glowed. Passengers snapped photos, whispered his name, recorded shaky videos. By the time they reached the terminal, the story had already begun to spread. A headline flashed across someone's screen. Bold and breathless passenger saves dozens in mid-air crisis. Jonathan frowned softly. He hadn't done it for headlines. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. Inside the terminal, chaos erupted in a different form. Airport officials swarmed, guiding passengers into secure areas, ushering Grace to a waiting ambulance. Some passengers clung to Jonathan, shaking his hand, thanking him again and again. One man gripped his shoulders, tears in his eyes. "You gave me back my family. My little girl, she's alive because of you." Jonathan placed a steady hand on the man's arm, his voice calm. "She's alive because we all held together. Remember that." But the man shook his head fiercely. "No, it was you. Don't let anyone tell it different." As the crowd thinned, Jonathan finally sank into a chair in the terminal, his body heavy with exhaustion. Emily Dawson approached quietly, kneeling beside him. "The press is already here," she murmured. "They're asking for your name. Some passengers gave it. By tomorrow morning, you'll be everywhere." Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "That's not what I wanted." "I know," Emily said gently, "but maybe it's what people need. To see someone like you not just surviving prejudice, but rising above it." Jonathan looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "They'll twist it. They always do. Some will call it luck. Others will say I shouldn't have been in first class to begin with." Emily shook her head firmly. "And more will call you what you are, a hero." Richard Coleman stood a few feet away, watching. He had remained silent since their final exchange on the plane. Now, he stepped forward, his voice hoarse but determined. "Jonathan, the world needs to hear this story. They need to hear it from you." Jonathan studied him, the man who hours earlier had tried to take his seat, who had looked at him with scorn and disbelief. Now, Richard's face was stripped of arrogance, lined instead with humility. Jonathan's voice was steady. "No, the world doesn't need me. They need the truth, that a black man sat in a seat he was told he didn't deserve, and when the sky turned against us, he was the only one who could save it." Richard swallowed hard, nodding slowly. His eyes glistened. "Then let me be the one who says it. Let me be the one who admits I was wrong." Jonathan's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected Richard to offer himself as the cautionary tale. "Do that," Jonathan said finally. "Not for me. For everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." Hours later, as dawn broke over New York, Jonathan sat in a quiet corner of the terminal. Exhaustion pressed heavy against him, but sleep wouldn't come. His phone buzzed with messages, colleagues, employees, even strangers who had already found his name online. Headlines multiplied, Black CEO saves passenger mid-flight. First-class discrimination turns into heroism. From humiliation to hero. The story of Jonathan Carter. Jonathan turned the screen face down. He didn't want to see himself turned into a symbol. He hadn't acted for applause. He hadn't acted to prove anything. He had acted because lives had hung in the balance, and silence had never been an option. Grace Miller's daughter arrived at the hospital hours later, tears spilling as she embraced her mother. Reporters swarmed outside, microphones flashing, cameras clicking. Grace, still weak but alive, spoke softly to them. He saved me. He saved all of us. And he did it after being treated like he didn't belong in the very seat that put him close enough to act. Her words rippled outward, carried by headlines, replayed in evening broadcasts. Jonathan's face appeared on screens across the country. Not in stage photographs, but in shaky cell phone footage, a man kneeling in the aisle, pressing compressions into a stranger's chest, steady as the world panicked around him. By evening, social media roared. Hashtags trended. My Jonathan Carter. He belongs. Flight hero. Some posts celebrated him. Representation matters. Jonathan Carter proved tonight that brilliance can come from places too many still dismiss. Others carried outrage. Imagine if they had kicked him out of that seat. Imagine what would have happened. But not all voices were kind. Some scoffed, diminishing his actions, twisting the narrative. Jonathan had expected that. Progress never came without backlash. He read none of it. He didn't need to. Late that night, Emily called him. Her voice was quiet, but resolute. Jonathan, the airline wants to issue a statement. They're bracing for fallout from what happened at boarding. People are already demanding accountability. Jonathan closed his eyes. Good. Let them. But Emily, don't let them turn this into a story about one airline or one gate agent. This is bigger than that. This is about every assumption people carry when they look at someone like me. Emily was silent for a long moment. Then she said softly, I'll remember that. Jonathan finally returned to his hotel, where his conference presentation lay forgotten in his bag. He stood by the window, staring out at the skyline. New York glittered beneath him, alive and humming. He thought of his father, of the cashier, of the professor, of every scar that had brought him here. He thought of Grace's frail hand squeezing his, of Richard's humbled admission, of Emily's whispered respect. The world was already telling his story. But deep down, Jonathan knew the truth. This wasn't about heroism. It wasn't about proving himself. It was about belonging not in a seat, not in a class, not in a fleeting headline, but in the unshakable truth that he had always deserved to be exactly where he stood. Jonathan Carter had never felt so heavy stepping through his own front door. The quiet hum of his Washington, D.C. townhouse was a stark contrast to the flashing lights, microphones, and headlines that had followed him since the landing. He set his suitcase down and stood still for a moment, listening to the silence. No applause, no cameras, just the faint ticking of the wall clock. For the first time in 2 days, Jonathan let himself exhale. His body sagged as if gravity had doubled. He dropped into the couch, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. The world was calling him a hero, yet inside he felt something more complex, heavier. He hadn't sought fame. He hadn't sought redemption. He had only sought survival for himself, for Grace, for the hundreds of souls who had trusted the sky that night. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Dozens of missed calls, news outlets, colleagues, strangers, invitations to speak, offers for interviews. hashtags still trending. Jonathan ignored them all. He wasn't ready to be consumed by the noise. Instead, he dialed one number he hadn't called in years. His mother's voice answered, warm and steady. Jonathan. He closed his eyes, the sound of her grounding him. Mama, I'm home. There was a pause. Then her voice softened. I saw the news. Baby, are you all right? I'm all right, he whispered. But I don't know what to do with all this attention. They want to call me a hero. I don't feel like one. His mother's laugh was gentle, tired but kind. That's because real heroes never do. You didn't do it for them, Jonathan. You did it because it was right. And that's what makes it matter. Her words washed over him, soothing yet piercing. He remembered nights as a boy when she had come home from double shifts, her uniform wrinkled, her eyes weary but bright. She had never sought recognition either. She had simply done what needed to be done. Don't let them define you, she said firmly. Don't let their story take away your truth. You know why you acted. Hold on to that. Jonathan nodded slowly, though she couldn't see it. I will. Good, she replied. Now rest. Tomorrow can wait. The next morning, Jonathan tried to return to normal. He brewed coffee, flipped through a newspaper, scanned emails, but the world would not let him fade quietly. Every headline screamed his name, the man who saved Flight 262. Jonathan Carter, hero or symbol. First-class discrimination sparks national outcry. Colleagues sent messages of pride. Activists called him an emblem of resilience. Politicians hinted at invitations. Jonathan closed the laptop with a sigh. He had built his life on discipline, on business, on quiet determination. Now, strangers wanted to make him something larger than life, something he had never asked to be. Later that week, he walked through the PulseTech offices, where employees greeted him with applause. Young interns snapped photos, eyes wide with admiration. A project manager whispered, "You showed the world what leadership looks like." Jonathan gave polite smiles, nods of thanks, but inside, unease lingered. He wasn't sure if they admired him, or the idea of him that the media had created. That evening, he found himself in his office, lights dim, staring at the city through the glass. His reflection in the window looked back tired, worn, but resolute. Who am I now, he wondered. A businessman, a survivor, a symbol. The answer came unexpectedly days later, when a letter arrived. Not an email, not a text, but a handwritten letter sealed in a plain envelope. It was from a young college student in Atlanta. Mr. Carter, it read, I saw your story on the news. I'm studying engineering, and some days I feel like I don't belong. People look at me and assume I'm not capable. But then I read about you. You reminded me that I don't have to wait for permission to prove myself. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone. Jonathan's chest tightened as he read the words. His throat thickened, eyes blurring. It wasn't applause. It wasn't fame. It was resonance. One life touched. One voice encouraged. And in that moment, Jonathan understood. This was never about being a hero. It was about showing others that belonging wasn't granted. It was claimed. On a quiet Sunday, Jonathan visited his father's grave. The cemetery was still, leaves rustling gently. He stood for a long time before the headstone, hands in his pockets. Dad, he murmured, I finally understand. All those years you carried your silence, your disappointments, your battles. I thought they broke you, but maybe they were shaping me. Maybe every doubt I faced was preparation for that night. He crouched, brushing dust from the stone. I wish you could have seen it. I wish you could have seen me. For a long time. He stood in silence, letting the wind move around him, letting the weight of generations settle into his bones. Jonathan knew the world would keep talking. The airline would issue statements. The press would chase interviews. Richard Coleman would likely appear on television, confessing his prejudice and praising the man he had once dismissed. Grace Miller would tell her children about the stranger who gave her back her life, but Jonathan didn't need any of that. What mattered was this: he had faced humiliation, danger, and doubt, and he had not faltered. He had chosen action over silence, and in doing so, he had claimed the truth that had always been his. He belonged. That night, Jonathan sat at his desk, pen in hand, drafting a letter, not to the press, not to the airline, but to the young student in Atlanta. You don't need to become me. He wrote, you already are enough. You belong, right where you are. Remember that when the world tells you otherwise. Belonging isn't given, it's lived. He signed his name, folded the letter, and sealed it with quiet resolve. The headlines would fade, the noise would pass, but the truth would remain, carried forward by those who needed it most. And Jonathan Carter, once told he did not belong in first class, knew at last that belonging was never a seat to be taken away. It was the unshakable truth of his life. The weeks that followed blurred into a storm. Jonathan Carter's name moved across headlines, talk shows, podcasts. People debated his actions, dissected the discrimination at boarding, replayed shaky video clips of him pressing on Grace Miller's chest or crouching at the cockpit panel. Yet for Jonathan, life remained strangely quiet. He woke early, brewed coffee, walked to work. The world outside roared, but inside, he stayed steady, anchored in the knowledge of why he had acted. He never watched his own interviews replayed on television. He never scrolled through the endless social media posts. He didn't need to. What mattered were the quieter voices, the handwritten letters, the whispered thanks in grocery aisles. The young man who approached him on the metro and said, because of you, I stayed in my program. Those were the echoes Jonathan chose to hear. One evening, he was invited to a university lecture hall in Baltimore. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking was never his pursuit. But when he learned the audience would be students, many first generation, many doubting their place in higher education, he agreed. The hall was full when he stepped to the podium. Students leaned forward, eyes wide, notebooks open. Some wore expressions Jonathan recognized, the mixture of hunger and uncertainty, the weight of carrying invisible battles. He spoke not of heroism, nor of saving flights. He spoke of doubt, of humiliation, of the countless times he had been told he did not belong, and of the choices he made anyway. Belonging, he said softly, his voice carrying through the hall, isn't a seat someone gives you. It isn't permission. It isn't recognition. Belonging is the truth you carry inside, that no one can take away. The night of that flight didn't prove my worth. It revealed a worth I already had. The hall was silent for a moment. Then applause rose, not wild, but steady, deep, heartfelt. Jonathan bowed his head slightly, accepting not their praise, but their understanding. Back in Jonathan met Richard Coleman for coffee. Richard had reached out multiple times, insistent on seeing him. When they finally sat across from each other, Richard looked thinner, older somehow, his arrogance stripped away. I've been speaking publicly, Richard admitted, his hands wrapped around his mug. About what I did. about what I assumed when I saw you in that seat. People don't like to confess their prejudice, but I've learned silence only protects the wrong things. Jonathan studied him, then nodded. It's not about punishment, Richard. It's about honesty. If your honesty helps someone see themselves, then maybe it matters. Richard's eyes softened. It was more than honesty. It was repentance. Jonathan sipped his coffee, his gaze steady. Then let it be more than words. Let it change how you live. Richard nodded, and in that moment, Jonathan saw something rare. Humility turned into resolve. Grace Miller wrote Jonathan from her recovery bed weeks later. Her handwriting wavered, but her words were steady. You saved my life, Jonathan. But more than that, you reminded me that courage doesn't look like uniforms or titles. Courage looks like a man choosing to act when everyone else is frozen. I will tell my grandchildren not just what you did, but what it meant that dignity and strength can live in any seat, no matter who tries to deny it. Jonathan read the letter twice, his chest swelling with quiet gratitude. He placed it in a drawer, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. A reminder for days when the world's noise pressed too loudly. Months later, Jonathan stood again in an airport terminal, ticket in hand. This time, no one questioned his seat. No one glanced at him with suspicion. If anything, a ripple of recognition followed him as he boarded. But Jonathan didn't walk taller because of it. He walked with the same steady step he always had. Belonging was no longer a question for him. It was a truth he carried into every space. As the plane lifted, he gazed out the window at the sky stretching wide and endless. For a moment, he closed his eyes, remembering the roar of alarms, the pounding of compressions, the hiss of failing hydraulics, and then he let it go. The sky had tested him, and he had answered. In quiet moments, Jonathan still wrestled with doubt. He still remembered the sting of being told he didn't deserve his seat. But those memories no longer bound him. They shaped him. Yes, but they no longer defined him. He had chosen belonging again and again, until it became unshakable. And that was his legacy, not the headlines, not the hashtags, not the applause. His legacy was the reminder that dignity is not granted, but lived, that courage is not loud, but steady, that belonging is not offered, but claimed. One Sunday evening, Jonathan walked the streets of DOC, the air crisp, the city alive with its usual hum. He passed a mural freshly painted on a brick wall, a black man standing tall against the sky, with words scrawled in bold beneath him, "He belongs." Jonathan stopped, staring at it for a long moment. People passing pointed at the mural, taking photos, smiling. Some recognized him, their eyes widening in surprise. He gave them a small nod, a faint smile, and kept walking. He didn't need to claim the mural. He didn't need to own the words. He lived them. And so, Jonathan Carter, once a passenger denied his place, became something larger. Not because he sought it, but because he embodied it. He was proof that dignity survives doubt, that courage outlasts prejudice, and that belonging is not a seat in first class, but the unshakable truth that no one can take away. And in that truth, countless others found their reflection. Life often tests us in the moments we least expect. Jonathan Carter's story reminds us that dignity is not something handed out by others. It is something we carry inside, even when the world doubts us. Many of us, especially as we grow older, know what it feels like to be overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. Yet those very moments can become the soil where courage takes root. Jonathan did not act because he wanted praise. He acted because he could not bear to remain silent when lives were at stake. That is the essence of real strength, choosing responsibility when it would be easier to turn away. For us, the lesson is clear. Belonging does not come from approval or recognition. It comes from living true to our values, stepping forward when it matters, and showing others through our actions that they too have worth. No matter our age, background, or scars, we each carry the power to make choices that ripple far beyond ourselves. The question is not whether we belong, it is whether we dare to live as though we always did. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If Jonathan's story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep spreading stories that inspire courage, dignity, and hope.